So I think we can start now.
All right, over to you, Shivangi.
Yeah, thanks, Professor. So hi, good afternoon. I would like to welcome Dr. Shreyashi, who is an integral part of JSGP and has a lot to offer in terms of or has a lot to offer in terms of her classroom experience while teaching, taking classes online during this pandemic. So I won't take much of your time, and I would quickly hand over the conversation to Shreyashi, who has I think slides for us to go through. So over to you, Shreyashi.
Thank you, Shivangi. Thank you, Geeta, for organizing this. Thank you, Dean Sudarshan, for suggesting this talk. I don't think I would have thought about this otherwise. And I'm also grateful to my colleague Vivek. And this really started with an email conversation we were having about assessments and pedagogy, and it turned into this talk. So I hope I have something to share today based on what I did in the classroom, but I'm more excited to hear from all of you based on some of the things that worked in your classrooms. While I'm hoping that this will be like an interaction, the first half is just a couple of slides that I put together based on what I did and some of the assessments for the courses that I taught. Okay, so hello everyone, my name is Shreyashi Dasgupta, and the talk today is titled Experiments with Pedagogy, Learnings from the Virtual Classroom. You might have seen in the abstract already the kind of teaching and assessment tools I'm planning to speak to you all about. Before that, I just want to share a little bit of my own experience. During the pandemic, I joined JSGP last year in July 2020 in the middle of the pandemic, which meant that we all were teaching virtually. I did not get a chance to be on the campus. Had to design courses keeping in mind these new realities that we found ourselves in. And in that entire process, I kept wondering that I never had a chance to meet the students or the colleagues. And it all felt like working with these multiple experiments when it came to the coursework and the assessment styles. And in doing during this time, I had several other conversations with colleagues who were teaching in universities around the world to also understand, the kind of challenges everybody pretty much faced and how people were dealing with it in their own ways. So today's talk is a lot about reflection, which is why I also want to talk a bit about the reflective pedagogical approaches that has already been written about widely in the pedagogical literature. I have not done a lot of readings around these pedagogical approaches before. So for me, it is also learning by doing from the classroom. And hopefully through the methods and the strategies that I share, we can open this up for discussions to hear more from you all. Okay, so when I was thinking about the teaching and learning process during the pandemic, I understand that the impact of the pandemic was deeply linked to the challenges that we saw in the classroom around the health of the students and the teachers, the delay in the internet, questions of access, working from home, finding ourselves in isolation. So the question really was, how do we keep teaching in these moments of crisis? And how do we design pedagogy around these moments, and what happens in a virtual classroom? So the course curriculum that I designed for particularly the two courses that I designed from scratch, just you can see on the slides, I taught 4 courses in total. One was on organization and development, another course on critical writing, the third one was on urban housing, and the fourth one was on qualitative research methods. methods. So today's presentation, I'm going to focus on two courses and experiences from particularly those two courses, which is on critical writing and on urban housing. Another important point when I talk about these methods is also to keep in mind that I was looking at both large and small size classroom environments. So some of these strategies might have worked well in a large size classrooms and others might have worked well in a small size classrooms. When I say large, I mean mostly between 60 to 75 students, 75 being like the highest that I had for my critical writing class, but also the small sized ones around electives, which was mostly up to 15 to 20 students. Okay, so I have the presentation kind of divided into three segments. This is the first segment where I'm going to talk about the audio visuals that I used, and probably one of the most common methods that we see a lot of people experiment with in the virtual classrooms. So when it came to audio visuals, the first thing that I looked at was short videos. I did not screen any movies. I focused only on short videos, keeping in mind the modules that I was teaching. And this one was particularly relevant for my housing course because the videos were brief. It targeted on certain learning goals that I had in mind for the module that I was teaching. These short videos had an instant connect with the readings that were already recommended to the students. At the onset, I want to also say that like any other courses, I had a syllabus, I had a long reading list with, the essential readings and the recommended readings. So all the tools that I now share are complementing in some or the other ways to that reading list that I developed for the students. So thinking about the videos, one of the main questions was also when to use these videos. Is it only about, incorporating it when I'm teaching a certain module, keeping in mind, what I want them to get out of these videos or how the students might interpret these videos, how helpful were these videos? And the third question was, how do we embed them within the class discussion? So I've given links of two short videos on the side, which is a combination of an academic style of an interactive video, and the second one was a popular TED Talk video on housing. So also a mix of different kinds of videos that I selected for certain topics. I thought that this was an active learning methods because I was using these videos also as a way to, also as a way to encourage class discussion. So it was interesting when I reflect on how these videos worked and how I kind of strategized putting these videos. Sometimes it worked in a way that the videos helped me break the class silence. If I taught a module and if I asked them questions, and sometimes we all know the silence that we get when we are not really sure who's responding, who's not. And in those moments, I always found having some kind of audiovisual cues are extremely helpful to initiate conversations. So that was a point where the videos worked really well. I also used some of the videos to end my lecture, which was also a moment to think and reflect and give them something visual to close the conversation with. During the entire lecture. Videos, I thought, was also a moment for me to pause, give the students a break, let them breathe, let them sink in all the lecture conversations that we had during the class time. So in that sense, there were different ways how the videos were incorporated into the teaching learning process. And what else regarding these videos? Yeah, I think pretty much these are the things that I kept in mind. I have to say that, another thing that I maintained in the last 1 year was a teaching journal where I wrote down some of my teaching related reflections. So today's presentation, I also pull out a couple of these thoughts from the teaching journal that I kind of maintained throughout some of these courses. This also comes from an interest because I like ethnographic methods in research, so this kind of complements my own interest as well. Okay, moving on to the next one, which is the use of photo essays. This is an interesting point that I thought of sharing with you all because I have always used traditionally readings to teach, right? Like readings, journal articles, book chapters, books, and so on. This was the first time in my housing course I decided to also experiment with using of photo essays. So I was teaching a module on housing related displacement, rehabilitation, and resettlement. And for that particular class, I thought of opening up the conversation by showing them a couple of photographs, which was clicked by a Mumbai-based photographer who has documented a lot on displacement and rehabilitation-related issues. I thought that the photo essays were an interesting way to help the students think about the field at a time of a pandemic when the field is not really accessible to them in the way how they would like to do different kinds of field work, go out, look at different housing projects and what's going on. At the same time, they have some kind of visual understanding of what these things might mean based on the readings that they have already done. And by then, this was, I think, during week 4 or week 5. By then, we had already developed the understanding of housing from different perspectives. So the photographs and the photo essays, especially the interpretive captions of these essays, help the students kind of create a gaze, a kind of understanding where I ask them to interpret the photographs based on the class discussions and the readings they have done. And through these photographs, they basically shared in the class the different elements that they could identify with when they saw these images, or even the elements that they felt were disconnected. Right? So we discussed both ways, and I thought that was a way for us, for both the students and for me, to collectively explore the place that we are talking about, the city that we are discussing. It helped us explore the concepts that we were talking theoretically around displacement rehabilitation, also helped us connect to the policy literature on rehabilitation and resettlement that we were discussing in the class. So I thought that, using this for me, helped me open up those conversations with the students. While I used it as a teaching tool, I think this can also be converted into an assessment tool if somebody were to, assign a photo essay as an assignment, which I did not try. I just used it as a tool to teach. Okay, so this was the second thing. The other thing that was fun in the class was teaching using digital archives. This was a class when we were discussing in detail about evictions, housing evictions, and I showed them this project that was launched very recently called Missing Bastis. Which was a place where individuals got together to document the evictions that happened in Delhi between 1990 to 2020. If I just zoom out from my screen and quickly maybe show you what this might look like. Can you all still see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Let's speed now. So basically, this is what the website is. They have documented. So if you click on the different neighborhoods, they have documented, the age, the eviction agency, if the resettlement narratives, how many households got evicted, and and all the other details about the different places in this archive. And the students could actually, play around with the different information of these settlements. For some, they already knew the area really well because either they have lived in Delhi or they have worked there or visited the city. They are familiar with some of the neighborhoods. But for others, they also used it as a way to understand how some of the theories and some of the policies that they were studying, how were some of that translated into practice by a group of researchers, a group of activists, and the kind of initiatives that was happening in the city. Because this archive was interactive in nature, it helped the students engage with this process of mapping and understand the importance of translating these theories into practice. So this was an interesting kind of original archive we looked at. Now, if I go back to my presentation, I want to talk about the readings in this particular segment. So there are a couple of things that I tried with readings. Of course, like I said in the beginning, that I had an essential and a recommended reading list. Apart from that, I was just trying to think through that how do we break it down in the classroom to engage with the students as to what to read, how to read around these topics. So one of the strategies that worked well was the flipped reading. Now, just like the flipped classroom, the flipped reading exercise was basically the student had to share the readings with me that they wanted me to read based on a module that was taught in the class. Now, this worked very differently for the housing course, and this worked very differently for the writing class that I was teaching. So for the housing course, I just told them share a reading on a topic of their choice based on whatever. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry,
Yes,
I got
yes.
an error. Okay, yeah. So I gave them different prompts as to what are they going to send me with the readings. So basically, if they selected an article of their choice, would they analyze the article? Would they just tell me what is the main argument of the article and why I should read that article? Why have they selected that article for me to read? So that worked in a way for the housing class, but for the writing class, the critical writing class, this was interpreted in a different way, in the sense that using the different analytical parameters we discussed in the class, or they could just simply do like a straightforward summary of that article. If they were analyzing it, they would align it to the if they were analyzing it, they would align it to the specific discussions we had it in the class, and one of the assignment was around annotating these articles. I gave it as a group assignment for the writing class. And because by then, this was in the first semester, the students already had a reading list from the different courses that they had in the public policy class. So I just told them to select a reading list from any of the courses that they had access to, and they can take any of those articles from the reading list and annotate those articles, analyze the introduction, analyze the writing style, analyze how the evidence was presented, analyze how the conclusion was written, how the transitions were done. So they had to like annotate different parts and kind of, share all the details as a group. So these two were two bits from the reading exercises. The third point is actually around the book chapter reading and presentation. So this was something that I tried for my housing class this semester, where I assigned them a book. The book had, I think, 6 or 7 chapters. I divided the book chapters between all the students in the class. I made a pair, group of 2 students will present each chapter. I had some ideas in mind, why I was allocating that reading and how that book would be helpful early on in the course. This was in week 3. So fairly early on in the course, but I still wasn't sure what will come out of that exercise after the student presents it in the class. But it turned out to be interesting in the sense that the book created a good base, because also it was a evidence-based writing. It was not overtly theoretical. It had an experimental writing style. So the students really enjoyed reading the book chapters and presenting. And because we did this in week 3, by the time we reached the end of the course, in every class, somehow or the other, this book became a reference point for discussing. In the sense, all the examples and the details they read in this book during this book chapter presentation became like a common base of knowledge that both I and the students understood when we kept referring to this book as an example while teaching the course or describing certain concepts. Often this is hard because, if they're turning up into a class and if they haven't done a reading, it's difficult for me to also tell them that, in so-and-so reading, this is the example that I'm referring to, or you can read about this in detail. So this book chapter reading and presentation became a good ground that we could all sort of relate to from the beginning to the end of the course. So that was one of the outcomes that I hadn't really anticipated. Okay, thinking about the readings, the next slide I want to focus on is around the classroom debate. So I had this reading on the reading list for my housing course called Why India Cannot Plan Its Cities: Informality, Insurgence and the Idiom of Urbanization, by Ananya Roy. And this was just a recommended reading, which I thought of turning it into a classroom debate. And I told the students that they could use this article as a base to think about the points that the scholar had shared in the article, but the students should also use this article as a way to do further research to either support the motion or speak against the motion. And we divided the class into 2 groups. And this is how, I kind of moderated the debate. We had like a format that was circulated to the students before, and the teams prepared their points. What was interesting was that every student read the article very thoroughly to benchmark some of the points, both theoretical points, but also in practice the points that they were connecting to. And they also linked it to the cities that they are currently based in, to also bring in examples from cities that they are most familiar with, cities that they have lived and they associate with. And they kept bringing in different examples. So we had a bunch of interesting examples from different places in India, both small and big cities, in order to make this debate really lively. And the students put in a lot of effort, and I think we all agree as a class that this was one of the most exciting sessions that we had. Okay, now moving on from the debate, another worksheet that I told them was on podcasts. So this worksheet really came out of a discussion we had in the class, which was also during, I think, middle of the semester, when I did like just a conversation around, how the semester was going, or what kind of topics they are, they would want to learn, or they're finding it hard to understand in the class, and just a usual kind of feedback conversations in the beginning of the class, just to understand how things are going. And during that process, I realized that, there are certain topics that the students want to learn in this course that I hadn't covered so far in my teaching. And I could incorporate it in the next half of the semester. But I also thought of turning that and their interest into an assignment or a worksheet, like I called it. I told them that, okay, if you're interested in a specific topic that you would want to explore, why don't you attend something outside the classroom space and bring that conversation back into the classroom? So each student selected either a podcast or a seminar or a workshop or all the talks either at the university or outside the university that they had access to, now that all of these talks are on YouTube or on different virtual platforms. Students selected a talk or a topic of their choice. Some of them also selected some really interesting podcasts that they otherwise did not get a chance to listen to because of the assignments and the classes. They took that as an opportunity to attend it, write some points that they learned from that conversation, some questions that were raised while they watched it or attended it. So they made like a short summary of it and submitted that as a part of one of the worksheets. We had a really good discussion about understanding what did they learn outside the classroom spaces, not just what we were discussing amongst ourselves, but also bringing in knowledge from elsewhere. Okay. Now moving on to the next part, which is around assessments, which fairly ties into the conversations I've been sharing so far. In assessment, I designed these couple of worksheets in different ways to help kind of design a takeaway value from the lectures that I was delivering. So in one of the worksheet that I designed was on institution mapping, because I was talking about housing policies and different kind of housing institutions at the central, at the state level, parastatal agencies, and what kind of roles and responsibilities they have. So I thought of turning these points that we were discussing in class and the students were doing through their readings to also in a visual format where they had to submit a flow chart. They basically had to just do some research online based on either the central level authorities or the state level authorities. They could pick the states they come from, or they could just select it out of their own interest of the cities they might want to work on. So they had to do some online research, figuring out the roles and responsibilities, the hierarchy, the governance structure, which was also key to understanding housing policy in a way that, and we did this worksheet fairly early on in the course. I think this was for week 1 or week 2. Because most of the students responded to this worksheet by saying that it helped them just understand better about the governance structure, about which authorities is responsible for what, and since then whatever readings they were doing around these policies or around other housing related concepts and questions, they could constantly relate that, what kind of authorities are we talking about, who's responsible, what's happening around the different questions of politics and so on. So this flow chart was a useful one for this class. This was another worksheet when I did this module on rental housing. Now, for the rental housing module, we discussed rental housing policies and conversations around the state-built housing and private rental housing market. I told the students that they could either do a quick interview with, because they were all at home with their family, friends, relatives, or whoever they would have easy access to without kind of moving out because of the restrictions, or they could reflect on their own experiences if they have lived in different cities, if they have rented different housing properties in different cities. And we already had a couple of points that we noted down based on the readings that the students were assigned. So we had the points. They could look at what they were reading, or they could create their own questions and basically do an interview to understand any one aspect of the rental housing that we were discussing in the class. I just want to show you all a response to this assignment that a student submitted and how she interpreted it. So I will just zoom out again. Okay, hopefully you can see my screen. So, so my student decided to interview somebody who was working in their house, and she was also staying at her place. And she looked at one of the UN Habitat reports that we discussed in the class on rental housing, where there was a category on accommodations provided by employers. She interpreted some of the parts from that report, and she decided to talk to the living domestic worker at her house to talk about her experiences of living in the city. Yeah, so what was interesting from this interview was that she documented different questions, but she also gave a visual understanding of the room where the person is living in inside her own house. And she mapped out the different areas, how it was being used, who stayed with, and also the journey of this individual that she spoke to. And she spoke about the different movements. She spoke about, migrations. She spoke about housing scenario, about contracts, housing contracts, about employer relationships, and so on and so forth. So she put in all these details, but every time she spoke about a different housing option that the person used, she gave also a visual kind of interpretation with that. Also kind of, she also mapped the place of her work in the previous kind of housing spaces that she was living in, and asked really some interesting questions to document based on the conversations we had in the class. Okay, so I'll go back to my slide. Okay, so when I suggested this exercise, another student of mine, he submitted his assignment reflecting on his own experiences on rental housing in the cities that he has lived in. Along with that, he also shared a YouTube video that he did long time back, like maybe a couple of years back, on house hunting in Mumbai. And that was a fun video. He did it with a couple of stand-up comedians that I used as a cue to kind of feed into the class discussion because it was done by the student, Bilal. And apart from the way this narrative was framed in a fun manner, the video really pointed out a couple of important points that we were discussing in the class around discriminations related to housing, around the issues with middlemen and brokers when you look for rental places and so on. So this was also a good way to bring in the work that the student had already done to the class and to open it up for class discussion, which otherwise I wouldn't have known if not for the assignment, or I wouldn't have had a clue about this. So this was interesting as well as an outcome of the worksheet. The other worksheet that we had in the class was when I was teaching a module on large-scale residential projects and gated communities. apart from the discussions around land-related policies, I asked the students to analyze a housing-related advertisement from the local newspapers or any kind of video ads or SMSs or emails, how we get all these adverts related to these large-scale projects, and they had to analyze it based on the concepts we discussed it in the class, either questions around land or segregation, inequality, aspirations, aesthetics. They can pick up like any particular aspect to talk about it. So this was also, yeah, we got some really good responses from the students. And the final worksheet for this course was, I think this was really good from the responses that I got. The question that was given to them was, how has your conceptual understanding of urban housing developed during this course? And they just picked any particular concept from any of the modules taught to reflect on it and further write their understanding of that concept, which need not be like copy-pasting theories, but also encourage them to reflect on what they got out of it based on everything we discussed in the class. I have to say at this point that these assessments, or the worksheets as I call it, was just one aspect of these courses that I taught. They of course had to write like a research essay or a paper, so that component was already there. Which I did not really experiment with because it was a fairly traditional way of sticking to one way of assessing. So we can debate about how useful that is at some point. Okay, so I will not take a whole lot of time because I'm really interested in the discussion as well. Just maybe one last point around in the critical writing class, I also did like a quiz on plagiarism, which was already developed from one of the books that I was looking at. And I kind of adapted it and gave a plagiarism quiz to the students where they had to read different aspects of an original journal extract, and they had to give a reason as to if the other versions were plagiarized or not. So they had multiple options to select from, and they had to write a yes and no, but also explain, which text is plagiarized and give the reasons behind it, and which one was not, which one was summarized or kind of paraphrased well. Okay, so I use Microsoft Forms to design most of my worksheets. So if you all have used it already, you know that it's really simple to use it. But for others, if you just want to try, this is how the interface looks like. You can just select a choice or a text-based answer. You can also do lots of ratings-related things. I have used another interface called Slideto. If you have not used it, this was also something that I was inspired when I attended one of the talks at Jindal by Professor Swati Chawla from the Jindal School of Liberal Arts. She used it in her classroom, and I was really inspired by that. And I tried using Slido for a couple of sessions. And then maybe I went back to Microsoft Forms again. So it's interesting if you want to try it out and see how it works for you. Again, really easy to use, and there's a trial period that you can use it for free. Okay, and this is another kind of strategy that I used for my writing class. I encourage setting up of peer groups, which we also call the writing clinic. I have to say that this wasn't a compulsory session. I offered it as an over and above kind of a discussion space for the students. So it was a small group discussion session, which was led by students. They set the ideas that they wanted to discuss. So there was a clear goal. They decided the topic in advance. They decided the top format in advance, and shared with me the details they wanted to do for the writing clinic. And there were reading materials that were also there that the students selected. Basically, in a writing clinic, we did different activities. Either we did free writing as a class, we focused on otherwise on things like sentence structures, transitions, topic sentences, paragraphs. We also looked at analyzing different forms of writing. For example, one of the writing clinic only focused on summarizing and paraphrasing because the students needed help in there after we had a session on, how do you summarize and paraphrase, and especially after the plagiarism quiz, when they found it hard to understand, the difference and how one should do it by citing properly. So this was a really helpful writing clinic that I facilitated, but mainly it was led by the students. Okay, so I had a couple of student feedback, but I think I'll stop and just take some questions at this point and hear more from all of you. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Shreyashi. Thank you so much for this talk. I mean, personally, as somebody who teaches quantitative courses, much of the tools that can actually bring or make the conversation more interesting has been, unfortunately not available to me. Because like I said, like once you're making them practice maths or practice questions, it's pretty much a different ball game. So in that frame, I actually want to mention something very interesting, where I think one of the professor at IIT Goa did, and I think it was a meme which was shared heavily on social media. So he or she, I don't know who it was, did something very interesting. So their final exam was just one question, and it was a quantitative course where they said, so whatever you have learned from lecture 1 to lecture 30, find a question that you want to answer and then answer it in answer it in 2 pages, be as brief as possible, but answer it. So this was something which I felt like, given the current circumstances, was one of the ways where one of the ways your model of flipped reading was used in a quantitative course. But other than that, I would love to be a student in a class like in your classroom, to be honest. And I'll open the floor for discussion. I think we have some students here as well. I see the names. So, and before I ask the faculty to jump into the discussion, let's just hear some what are some students' thoughts. So, Arijit, if you want to speak, I know I'm putting you in a spot, but if you would like to take
perfectly fine with this, I'm more than happy to
please
speak.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Actually, I was hoping for Professor Shreyashi to talk about stuff about the exams as well, because I can speak for my batch. So my batch finds it incredibly monotonous when we have extra long question papers. And given that I'm an econ student, and what Professor just explained may not work well for math, but it would have been a good, maybe a different kind of pace for us, I guess, because doing questions over questions after a point, I get the reason that we have a course and it's a difficult subject, but it gets monotonous after a point, and then we start off losing interest. So burnout is actually a big problem, which I would like to just flag here. Professor, if I may, actually had a question to ask you. So you had mentioned about giving papers and maybe making summaries of the way they have researched and the way they have presented their work. Maybe your class was lucky, because speaking from my own experience, a professor has made us do something similar, and it was extremely painful because it was a 50-page long article, research paper, and making notes for all 50 pages or something of that sort is actually very, very tiring, and it takes a lot of effort. And basically skimming through tends to give you maybe not the best results, but it is functional. So would your suggestions work all the time, especially when it's a long paper, and given that we are a bachelor student and we're not used to reading lengthy papers?
No, thanks for your question. this is very valid. And like I said in the beginning, this is just based on the 2 courses that I taught, that I extensively thought through why I was doing what I was doing. The point also when we speak about reflective methodology or pedagogies is also taking these moments to think what might work in a certain scenario will not work in kind of other subjects or other circumstances. I think the point also is to understand what is the goal of that. Is it about assessing the student? Is it about just initiating a classroom interaction? Is it just about deciding, how do I navigate a classroom silence? Is it only about thinking, what kind of feedback might be incorporated based on what the student is suggesting into the teaching learning process? I think the question is also during the designing process itself, what are we trying to do? So I completely agree with you about the annotating the article thing might not work in different settings. I think it's something that definitely might be really chaotic for a large size classroom, which is what I also flagged in the beginning about keeping in mind the size of the different class and how the groups might be formed and how they might work in that manner, especially in a virtual space. So for the annotation exercise, which is why in my class, I don't think I was lucky, but I think it worked because I did not give them a lot of pointers to analyze. I was only focusing on doing a short summary, whereas in the other class where I had few number of students, they were doing it individually, which made it less chaotic. So I think it was also about choice and just deciding what might work, but I think it's yeah, you will never know till the time one tries out these scenarios. So thank you, yeah, for your question.
Yeah, so do we have more questions? I mean, we still have some time to take questions. Okay. Yeah, I think Professor Sudarshan has one question, so he's raised his hand.
It's not a question. It's just a comment.
Okay.
Firstly, this is very interesting, and I think we are at a point where we need to have more sessions of the kind that we just heard from Shreyashi. See, this is we've started a online MA public policy program. It'll roll out in September. Rajiv Malhotra is in charge of it, and we've enlisted some faculty to do the first few lectures as part of the MA program. But we're also doing some lectures which would be open source, so there's no fee for it. But what we have, the difficulty that faculty have is switching from the conventional classroom. What we've done is, instead of having the students physically in our presence, we now have them on MS Teams, so we can see their faces. We can ask them to switch on the video and try and communicate with them. But in the online program, it's the video and the lecture modules are all asynchronous. That is, students may watch them at any time. Now, the fundamental difficulty that people have had is, length of a video. Mohan Kumar, for instance, was the first to attempt this, and he enthusiastically prepared 4 modules with 30 minutes. And the agency that is meant to help with the production of these videos and inserting into them quizzes and questions and things like that Shreyashi had done, photographs, video clips, all of that. There's a firm specialized in these techniques. They rejected poor Mohan Kumar's work over several days saying 30 minutes is too long. You have to have it in 8 minutes. And then you've got to, and this is based on a long understanding that's developed in these programs by these companies like Coursera, that the attention span of students is really very short. In fact, if you think about it, Sesame Street, which was developed by the Children's Television Workshop, estimates that children's attention span is about 2 minutes. Now, as you grow older, you can manage a little more. But I think Coursera's advice is that an attention span to a lecture is only about 8 minutes in an adult. It's about 2 minutes in a child. And, if you see any Sesame Street episode, you'd find that there's a fair amount of repetition, which also helps in retention of what goes on. So I think we need to take this seriously. In other words, I think we have to all move away from conventional lectures and old-fashioned teachers, like when I used to teach. You switch on and then you carry on for 40 minutes. You stop and then look at a class and figure out if they've listened to you and have any questions. I think that all that's got to change. And now that we have this online thing where we have to perforce do things differently, I think bringing that back into the conventional classroom as well is going to be very much more helpful. And in that sense, Shreyashi has kind of pioneered this and is sharing it with us. But I think we need to organize some pedagogy workshops for ourselves as faculty. This is a start where we figure out, what works, what doesn't work. For instance, not to give an article of 50 pages for doing any work on it, as a student pointed out, it's much too long. I mean, these are all little tips that we need to have. And we also need to develop the capacity in-house, I think. We are paying a lot of money to a company called Skill Up, which is helping put together these videos of lectures for asynchronous learning. And their skill is really in this, in where to intersperse something that is a diversion, in the course of a lecture, which will connect to what is being said and so on. And then to have some pop-up quizzes so that that they are paying attention, because they wouldn't be able to answer the pop-up quiz which popped up on the screen in the course of your presentation unless they were paying attention and watching it. And that's a way of tracking who's and how many of them are paying attention and so on. So I think we need to develop more in-house capacity, because we can't continually keep employing some specialist firm. So I think within ourselves as a faculty, we need to have some of these workshops for learning how to teach. So Shreyashi, this is very, very important. And thank you very much for starting us off on that. That's all I wanted to say.
That's really helpful to know. This all started with an experiment because, like you said, this was a way that did not come naturally. It almost felt like because of the pandemic, one was forced to rethink about how we do what we do. And I was totally out of my comfort zone when I was trying these things out, because I'm just like how you said, we all like to have that sense of control in the first half of the class when we are doing a talk. But with these activities, you really don't know, what is coming out of it and how do you incorporate that discussion back into what you were teaching. So at every point, it was challenging, pushing my thoughts of understanding as to what I want to do in the class. And I have to say it's all because of the students that it became very interactive and engaging, because it felt like it was a two-way process, and they were equally a big part of the entire teaching learning process because of these class activities. So yeah, thank you. And Professor Noshini, thank you for your comment. I would love to hear more about your project. So yeah, I'll write to you. Just saw your chat. Anybody else? Any other questions, thoughts?
Yeah, any further comments or suggestions or questions? So yeah, it's already okay. So it's past 3, so we can conclude the session now. Thank you so much, Dr. Shreyashi, for agreeing to this talk. I mean, it's been so illuminating. I mean, we're all struggling with the pedagogy and teaching when it comes to our respective courses, and just listening your experience, how you have navigated through your last couple of semesters. I mean, it has really helped. I mean, and I'm sure, I mean, the recording, I mean, whosoever watches this would actually benefit a lot from this discussion. So thank you so much. Unless there is anybody else, I mean, I think, yeah, we can conclude the session. So
yeah, it's good to keep even our discussions shorter than we normally have been doing. So an hour is
it's
a
like
good time.
Earlier we used to have
90 minutes.
Yeah, 90 minutes.
And it gets a bit difficult. I mean, to find 90 minutes now that we're doing so much of this online. So ideally, we should reduce this and make it a rule that nothing should exceed an hour.
Yeah.
We are all talking about attention spans and how much somebody can learn in what period of time. And just having more time doesn't mean there's more learning. So let's stick to a 60-minute rule henceforth in these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank
Thank you for
Thank you,
hosting
Shreya.
this talk.
Thank you, Shreyashi.
So yes,
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Mani or Lalit, we can end the session now, so we can stop the recording. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.